It's hard to believe, but among all those who have spoken about the mysteries of life after death, she became the one whose words shocked millions around the world. We're talking about an ordinary hospice nurse who could no longer remain silent and revealed incredible things hidden from the public eye within the walls of medical institutions, places from which patients never return alive. Few hospice workers are willing to openly share what they have witnessed while caring for the dying. And yet the fact remains. Almost every one of them regularly encounters phenomena that defy science, medicine, and rational explanation. Barbara Karnes is one of the few who dared to speak out. And one of the most unsettling and mysterious topics she addressed is what happens in the weeks following death. During this time, strange coincidences begin to occur. Unexplainable events and subtle sensations, as if the boundary between worlds briefly becomes transparent. Barbara Karnes spent decades at the bedsides of the dying, and through thousands of observations, she noticed something most medical books do not teach. Dying is not a moment. It is a process. And this process, she explained, doesn't always end with the last heartbeat. For the loved ones left behind, the weeks following death can be filled with experiences that feel profoundly real, subtle yet deeply moving signs that the person who passed may still be present in some way. In her work, Karnes never claimed that the soul returns in a literal, supernatural sense. Instead, she framed these experiences as part of a natural emotional and spiritual unfolding that occurs during the transition between life and death, and even beyond it. Karnes described this unfolding as a continuation of the dying process, a time when both the dying and their loved ones are still emotionally and energetically connected. According to her, this connection doesn't disappear the moment life ceases. In her book, The Final Act of Living, she writes that dying begins weeks before physical death and may continue, on a subtle, energetic level, for some time afterward. Many families, she observed, reported feeling the deceased's presence for days or even weeks after death. These feelings often came in the form of vivid dreams, symbolic events, or physical sensations, like the smell of a familiar perfume, the sound of footsteps, or the inexplicable sense of someone sitting nearby. Importantly, Karnes never dismissed these experiences as mere imagination. While she didn't frame them as paranormal, she did consider them meaningful. She believed that these moments reflected the profound love and emotional bonds shared between people, bonds that don't vanish with death. In fact, she saw them as part of the healing journey. The grieving mind and heart, still deeply connected to the one who has died, may be more open during this period to receive emotional signals, real or symbolic, that help with the slow and painful process of letting go. In Gone From My Sight, Karnes expands on this by explaining how families often feel that something remains unfinished after death. This unfinished business can lead to a strong sense of the deceased still being close. Whether it's a lingering feeling in the house, a sudden sense of being watched, or recurring dreams that carry messages, she emphasized that such experiences are not pathological. They are part of what she called a natural grief process. These phenomena often occur within the first 2 to 6 weeks after death, a time frame she noted repeatedly in her writings and public talks. While she never tied this time frame directly to any religious or cultural tradition, the consistency of these reports suggests a kind of emotional or spiritual continuation. Karnes wrote that this post-death phase is often filled with quiet moments where the line between memory and presence becomes blurred. Families report hearing a voice say goodbye in a dream, feeling an unexpected warmth in an empty room, or witnessing events that seem too perfectly timed to be coincidence. For many, these events offer comfort. For others, they raise questions about the nature of consciousness and whether love truly dies with the body. Karnes didn't offer metaphysical answers. She stayed rooted in the human experience. But she did encourage people to honor what they felt, to talk about it, and to accept it as a real part of their journey through grief. Hospice nurses around the world have echoed her observations. Though each case is unique, many have noted this same pattern. The presence of the dying seems to linger for a short while, as though the transition between worlds isn't immediate, but gradual. Whether one believes in the soul or not, the emotional imprint left by someone we love appears to echo in our lives for a time. Karnes believed that acknowledging this presence, whatever form it takes, can be a powerful step in healing. Ultimately, Barbara Karnes never tried to prove anything beyond the physical. Her goal was to educate, to soothe, and to bear witness to what she had seen again and again in the quiet corners of hospice care. For her, the stories of continued presence weren't evidence of ghosts or spirits. They were signs of enduring love, of relationships that cannot be switched off like a light. The first few weeks after death, she believed, are not empty. They are filled with memory, connection, and, sometimes, the quiet sense that someone we love has not fully left us just yet. Barbara Karnes never intended to become a collector of mysterious stories. Yet, over the years, as she sat by the bedsides of thousands of dying people and comforted just as many grieving families, certain patterns emerged. Families, often unprepared for what followed death, would come back to her days or weeks later with voices full of wonder, confusion, or awe. They spoke of dreams, sensations, animal behavior, and events that couldn't easily be explained, but were so emotionally powerful that they refused to be ignored. And most importantly, the same timing echoed throughout them all. These stories almost always occurred within 2 to 6 weeks after death. One of the most frequent stories Karnes shared in her talks and writings involved dreams. Not ordinary dreams, but ones that felt deeply real. In the final act of living, she recalls families who described their loved ones coming to them at night, not sick or dying, but whole and at peace. In one case, a woman told Karnes that she had a dream 3 nights after her husband's passing. In the dream, he stood at the foot of her bed and smiled. "I'm okay," he said, "and you're going to be okay too." The woman woke up crying, not out of sadness but relief. She said it felt more like a visit than a dream. Karnes did not try to explain it away. Instead, she validated the experience as part of the natural grieving process, something many people experience but few talk about. Another story involved a patient who had promised his daughter that he would find a way to say goodbye if he could. A week after his passing, she reported waking up in the middle of the night to the strong scent of his aftershave in the room. There were no bottles of it left in the house. She had packed everything away. And yet, the scent lingered long enough for her to sit with it, cry, and feel a calm settle over her. Karnes shared this story to highlight how our sensory memory can become a bridge between the living and the dead, especially when the bond is strong and the emotions are still raw. In one of her lectures, Karnes spoke of a woman who had cared for her dying mother at home. A few weeks after her mother's passing, the woman was folding laundry in the living room when she heard her name called. Clearly, softly, in her mother's voice. She turned around, but no one was there. The house was empty. She checked outside, thinking perhaps the TV was on, but it wasn't. Karnes noted that this kind of auditory experience was not uncommon and did not necessarily suggest hallucination. Rather, it reflected how deeply the brain holds on to connection, voice, and presence in the early stages of grief. Animals, too, often became part of the stories families shared with Karnes. In the final act of living, she describes a case in which a cat that had been closely attached to its owner refused to eat or leave the owner's favorite chair after his death. Days later, the cat suddenly sat upright, stared at a corner of the room, and began to purr, something it hadn't done since the passing. It remained in that spot for several minutes before settling down peacefully. While Karnes didn't draw conclusions about what the cat had sensed, she emphasized that animals often respond to emotional and environmental changes that humans can't perceive as easily. Another woman described to Karnes how, 2 weeks after her brother died, she found one of his old wristwatches in a drawer, one that hadn't worked in years. When she picked it up, the second hand began to tick. It worked for 2 minutes and then stopped. She later told Karnes it felt like a sign. Small, silent, but meaningful. Karnes didn't claim these moments as supernatural proof. Instead, she reminded families that such events, whether interpreted spiritually or psychologically, help the grieving process by providing a sense of closeness and continuity. Karnes was especially careful not to label these experiences as paranormal. She believed that our relationships with the dying do not end abruptly, and that love often finds small ways to echo forward. The stories she collected were not about ghosts or spirits in the traditional sense. They were about human bonds, emotional, sensory, and deeply rooted, that often manifest in surprising ways. Her message was always gentle and grounded. Don't be afraid of these experiences. Don't dismiss them. Whether they come in dreams, scents, sounds, or moments of peace, they are part of how we continue loving and letting go. For Karnes, the stories mattered not because they offered proof of life after death, but because they honored the full scope of what it means to lose someone. In the quiet weeks following death, when grief is still fresh and reality is still settling in, people often become aware of things they would normally overlook. And in that delicate space, many have felt that their loved one was not entirely gone. Not forever. Not yet. Barbara Karnes often spoke about the emotional weight of unfinished goodbyes. In her work with dying patients and their families, she saw time and again how unresolved emotions, unanswered questions, or simply the suddenness of death could leave both the living and the deceased in a space of lingering connection. She never described this as a soul being stuck or trapped, but she did recognize that love, deep, enduring love, doesn't end abruptly. It looks for a way to complete itself. And very often this process plays out quietly in the weeks following death. In the final act of living, Karnes describes how people need time to emotionally process a loss, especially when they feel there was something left unsaid. She also observed that the dying, in their final hours, often express concern for the people they're leaving behind. This mutual holding on can create what she called a sacred space, where the connection remains alive just a little longer. During this time, often within the first 40 days, families report experiences that feel like moments of contact, a dream that brings peace, an object that suddenly reappears, a strong sense of presence during everyday activities. Karnes saw these as part of the emotional and spiritual completion of the bond. She emphasized the importance of ritual and symbolic gestures in helping both the living and the dead find closure. Simple acts, like writing a letter to the deceased, speaking out loud to them, or lighting a candle, can carry immense healing power. These acts, she believed, are not about summoning spirits, but about allowing the heart to say goodbye in its own way. In her writings, she recounted stories of people who felt restless or haunted by the loss until they took the time to formally release their loved one through a private ritual or conversation. Only then did the sense of lingering begin to ease. Karnes was particularly sensitive to the idea that some deaths happen so quickly or under such traumatic circumstances that the living are left in shock. In those cases, she noted, the grieving process may involve a search for meaning or connection that continues long after the funeral. For some, this takes the form of dreams. For others, it is simply a persistent thought. I didn't get to say goodbye. She encouraged people not to repress these feelings but to honor them by speaking about the deceased, revisiting shared memories, or creating something in their name. In doing so, they often found peace not just for themselves, but also a feeling that the loved one could finally move on. Importantly, Karnes never claimed that these experiences proved anything about the afterlife. She maintained a grounded, compassionate approach, always reminding her audience that these stories were part of the mystery of grief. Yet she could not ignore how often people felt these moments were real, and she believed that by allowing space for them, families could transition through their grief with more grace and less fear. For the dying, this space also mattered. She shared examples of patients who would not let go until a specific person arrived, or until they heard a particular reassurance. Only then would their body begin to release. To Karnes, this was not mystical. It was deeply human. In the early weeks after death, especially during the first month or so, this sense of emotional continuation seems to peak. People often describe feeling watched over or accompanied, especially during emotionally charged moments. Karnes did not suggest that the dead walk among us, but she acknowledged the emotional and psychological reality of these impressions. They are part of a process she described as finishing the conversation, a final exchange of love and release that sometimes doesn't fit within the rigid timeline of medical death. By naming this experience, not denying it, not mystifying it, Karnes helped countless people understand what they were going through. She gave them permission to feel without fear, to grieve in their own language, and to recognize that sometimes love takes time to let go. It doesn't mean something is wrong. On the contrary, it means something mattered deeply, and it still echoes, just for a while, in the spaces we leave behind. Barbara Karnes never directly mentioned the number 40 in her writings, but her observations repeatedly pointed to a period of 2 to 6 weeks after death as being especially meaningful. During this time, she noted, families often report the strongest feelings of presence, the most vivid dreams, and the deepest emotional processing. Though she approached death from a clinical and human perspective, not a religious one, her consistent references to this early window of time invite a deeper reflection. Why does this period matter so much, not just in personal experience, but across so many cultures and belief systems? In The Final Act of Living, Karnes described the weeks following death as a time of emotional and spiritual reorganization. She wrote that just as the body gradually shuts down in the days before death, the emotional ties between the dying and their loved ones often continue to shift and resolve in the days and weeks afterward. She did not claim that the soul lingers in a literal sense, but she acknowledged that something powerful happens during this period, something that families often feel, even if they don't fully understand it. Remarkably, this period mirrors what many spiritual traditions have taught for centuries. In Orthodox Christianity, it is believed that the soul remains close to the earth for 40 days, visiting familiar places and people before its final departure. Families often hold memorial services on the 3rd, 9th, and 40th days after death to support this journey. In the Tibetan tradition, the Bardo Thodol, known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes an intermediate state lasting up to 49 days, during which the consciousness undergoes transitions before rebirth or liberation. Similar beliefs appear in ancient Egyptian practices, where the soul journeyed through the duat for weeks before reaching judgment, and in Hinduism, where rituals for the deceased extend over a period of weeks to aid the soul's passage. Karnes did not draw from these traditions directly, but the consistency between her practical, observation-based timeline and these ancient beliefs is striking. While she focused on the human experience, on grief, memory, emotional connection, her insights reflect a deep harmony with spiritual wisdom passed down for generations. Whether these cultural timelines originated from mystical knowledge or from the same kinds of patterns Karnes noticed in modern hospice care is not something she speculated on, but the overlap is too strong to ignore. In many of her talks and writings, Karnes emphasized that dying is not just a medical event. It is a transition, one that affects not only the person dying, but also those left behind. This transition does not end at the moment of death, but rather unfolds over time. And that unfolding, she observed, usually reaches a turning point within the first month or so. It is in these days and weeks that people often begin to feel a shift, from the intensity of early grief to something quieter, more settled, more complete. And it is also during this time that the sense of a loved one's presence often begins to fade. Not abruptly, but gently, as if part of a natural release. Karnes frequently spoke of the idea of going home in metaphorical terms. In Gone From My Sight, she describes the dying person as someone preparing for a journey, not toward nothingness, but toward something beyond. She avoided doctrinal statements, but was clear in her belief that death was not the end. This idea, too, aligns with many spiritual teachings that speak of the soul's journey beyond the body, often requiring time, peace, and the support of those still living. In the end, what Barbara Karnes offered was not theology, but truth born from experience. Her timeline, those 2 to 6 weeks of subtle transition, was drawn from listening to thousands of people, both dying and grieving, across decades. The fact that her observations coincide so closely with ancient spiritual timelines is not proof of anything metaphysical, but it is deeply meaningful. It suggests that human beings, across cultures and centuries, have felt something similar during this time. Whether one believes in the soul or not, the 40 days after death carry a weight that is emotional, psychological, and perhaps something more. For Karnes, the purpose was never to prove what happens after death, but to help people live with what happens around it. And in doing so, she reminded us that the moments we call coincidence, the signs we quietly acknowledge, the peace we begin to feel in the 4th or 5th week, these are all part of a rhythm older than any one belief system, a rhythm that suggests that love lingers, connection softens, and farewells, when they come, unfold slowly and naturally. Dear friends, if you liked the video, please like it and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.